the wishes of the people of southern Sudan and the Darfur provinces. We'll see now how this referendum plays out. You can bet the Chinese are worried about southern Sudan becoming independent and putting their oil leases in jeopardy. But most of all, it affects how China deals with the aspirations of countries like Iran to acquire deliverable nuclear weapons. As China has seen North Korea develop and even test that capacity in recent years without imposing the kind of sanctions that China alone would be capable of imposing, we can see that despite the facade of international disapproval of Iran's quest for nuclear weapons, China is buying its oil and natural gas. China is investing in its petroleum infrastructure. China is building refining capacity. China is increasing its capital expenditures in exploration and drilling. And this sends a profound signal around the world as the United States and its friends in Western Europe try and stop Iran's quest for nuclear weapons, that we are on a path doomed to failure. And I think this is perhaps the most important, the most significant area of foreign policy for the United States, for Israel, for our other friends in the region in the next few years. Iran is, to me, the central source of danger and risk and instability in the Middle East. It is, and has been for many years, the world's central banker for terrorism. And it is an equal opportunity supporter of terrorism. It funds the Shia Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Sunni Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It funds all kinds of terrorism in Iraq against our forces and other NATO forces. And it supports its once former sworn enemy, the Taliban, in Afghanistan, also in attacks and opposition to American forces and those of our allies. This is the threat in the Middle East that poses far and away the greatest long-term danger to our interest. And what has been the response of the Obama administration for the last 2 years? It has focused on stopping Israeli settlement construction on the west bank of the Jordan River. Now, surely we can all see the logic. If only Israel had stopped building housing, Iran would give up its nuclear weapons program. How hard is that to figure out? This is the kind of myopia that leads other nations to come to the conclusion that the administration simply doesn't understand or doesn't care enough to understand the complex world reflected in the Middle East. This idea that if only we could reduce tensions between Israel and Palestinians or the Arab neighbors, or even better, solve these problems, that sweetness and light would break out in the Middle East and every other problem would become easier to solve. It's not a theory that Obama alone holds. It's very widely held. That's part of the problem. But it's like looking through the wrong end of the telescope. You could stop housing construction on the West Bank now. It wouldn't change a thing in the Middle East, except that the Palestinians would come up with another new demand that they would expect the United States under this administration to impose on Israel. Now, the consequence of this obsessive focus on settlement construction and other concessions to deliver from Israel to the Palestinians has meant that in the last 2 years we have had less progress between Israel and the Palestinians than at any point since the Madrid Peace Conference. Now, you would think that this empirical reality would have an impact on the Obama administration, and I have to say, I rarely undertake something that's naive, but I actually thought maybe after the election they would find a delicate way to ease George Mitchell out and find something else to do with their time other than worry about settlements and the activities of the Israeli government that the Palestinians object to. But unfortunately, there's no sign of that. The amount of effort and focus and concentration that has been devoted to this issue is without parallel. And one important consequence is not only has it failed to accomplish the objectives that the administration sought. Not only has it thereby put the United States in a worse position in the Middle East and the world, because we are correctly perceived to have pursued a policy and failed at it, thus making us weaker in the eyes of others. It has distracted the administration from everything else that's going on. Let's just look at the past few days. You've had rioting in the streets of Tunisia that's overthrown the Ben Ali government. We have rioting in Cairo and in the past few days, rioting in Yemen. Now, the administration is clearly caught by surprise. I think, honestly, everybody was. But they now can't decide what their policy is. And there are signs from what they've said publicly that they're conflicted between worrying a little bit about longtime American allies disappearing from the scene, on the one hand, versus being criticized for not being in favor of human rights. Well, I can solve this confusion for them. The policy you pursue in a circumstance like that is what's in the best interest of the United States. How about that for a novel idea? And in cases like this, what's in the best interest of the United States is trying to decide whether the alternatives to something like the Mubarak regime are more desirable than keeping the regime in power. Let's face it, Mubarak is not a Jeffersonian Democrat, and he's never going to be. If the alternative were the Mubarak regime versus a real Jeffersonian democracy, even though Patrick Henry might have some objection to that, you would say, great, let's have a democracy. That's not necessarily the choice. That's not even necessarily the most likely choice. A very likely, a more likely scenario is that this is a comparison between the Mubarak regime on the one hand and the Muslim Brotherhood on the other. That would be, as they say, bad for the United States. That ought to tell us something. That would even be bad for Egypt. You can't guarantee that because the people in the streets say they want freedom and democracy, that they can deliver it if they took power, or that they're going to take power to begin with. And given what we know about what university students have learned in Egypt and other parts of the Arab world in recent years, I'm not at all sure that whether they're adherents to the Muslim Brotherhood or not, that what they really have in mind is something very, very different from the kind of largely secular, if authoritarian state that Mubarak has had in power. That doesn't mean I'm here to justify the way Mubarak has ruled Egypt. It's to say the United States has to face concrete choices, not between abstractions, but between the possibilities that exist in the real world. And if the administration doesn't understand that in these cases in Egypt and Yemen and Tunisia, if this violence spreads more widely, we're going to be in real difficulty. If the administration needed a case study of what can go wrong, even when an effort begins in legitimate transformation to democracy, let's just consider two other examples that have occurred within the past 10 years. How about democracy in the territories for Palestinians? How about that election of Hamas as the ruler in the Gaza Strip? There's a real triumph for democracy. How about what's happening in Lebanon, where the Cedar Revolution, a real effort to bring legitimate representative government to Lebanon, may be on its last legs as a Hezbollah-backed prime minister is installed. Even though the Lebanese constitution requires that the three major offices be divided among Sunnis, Shias, and Maronite Christians, now all three top constitutional office holders are entirely beholden to Hezbollah. This is a country that's passed out of civil war into representative government and maybe passing right back out of it. So before we get too enthusiastic about Twitter revolutions, we better ask ourselves, what are we really faced with in terms of realistic alternatives? Because what's really going on here, I fear, is the increase in influence of radical Islamicists throughout the Middle East. We certainly see this in the case of Lebanon and then back through Syria. These are effectively proxies of Iran. In the Arab regions In the governments of the Arabian Peninsula and in North Africa, minority Shia populations have been used by the mullahs in Tehran for their own purposes, and we see no better demonstration of that than what's happening in Iraq. Another effort at democracy, that American withdrawal, which the administration has pledged by the end of this year, could well plunge back directly under the influence of Tehran, thus making the entire effort at overthrowing Saddam Hussein in 2003 have turned that into a negative because of the Obama administration's policy. And the same could be true if we, in fact, begin a substantial withdrawal from Afghanistan in the summer of this year, as the President has promised. You know, the focus on countries like Iran, because of the dual threat that they face, is something that should be consuming to an American president. And yet our response to Iran has largely been, for 2 years, following what the President told us he was going to do in the inaugural address, saying with respect to both Iran and North Korea, we will hold out our hand if only they will unclench their fist. So for 2 years, American diplomats have wandered the world looking for some Iranian to shake hands with, to see if maybe they could succeed in chit-chatting Iran out of its nuclear weapons program. Well, it's not going to happen. And if you needed another piece of evidence, the weekend negotiations in Istanbul ended with a thud, as have the umpteen negotiation sessions between the Perm 5 plus Germany and Iran since they began in the middle of the last decade. The fact is, Iran is not going to give up its nuclear weapons program. The fact is that the Stuxnet virus, as effective as it was caused only a modest delay in Iran's nuclear program. Don't get me wrong, I think the Mossad is a fantastic intelligence agency. I also think it's a great propaganda agency. And if your opponent thinks you're 10 feet tall, maybe you are 10 feet tall. The sanctions that the administration says have slowed Iran down in its nuclear weapons program have produced no effect whatever. They have caused incremental economic pain to the regime. I certainly approve of that. I approve of anything that destabilizes the regime. But don't operate under the illusion that the sanctions are going to stop the Iranian nuclear weapons program. They're not even capable of bringing Iran to the negotiating table for serious discussions, much less having an impact on the nuclear issue. So that the prospect that we face in the Middle East very, very soon, in my view, is that you're going to have an Iran with nuclear weapons. Diplomacy has failed, the sanctions have failed, other steps like cyber warfare have failed, and the Iranians, together with the North Koreans with whom they are undoubtedly working, are getting very, very close to the point where they will have deliverable nuclear weapons. Now, what worries me is that I think the administration's plan B is to say, okay, look, we don't like Iran with nuclear weapons, but we can live with it. We can contain and deter Iran the same way we contained and deterred the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This is a fundamental misperception, a misunderstanding of the calculus of deterrence that existed during the Cold War. It's true that it worked. I don't particularly want to go back to living under the threat of being nuked by some bunch of fanatics over whom we have no control, hoping that our calculus of deterrence is the same as theirs. But even if I were wrong in that, even if Iran could be contained and deterred, it doesn't stop with Iran. Saudi Arabia will get nuclear weapons, Egypt will get nuclear weapons, Turkey will, perhaps others, so that in a very short period of time, 5 to 10 years, you could have half a dozen nuclear powers in the Middle East with relatively small numbers of nuclear weapons. And every morning, they would get up and say to themselves, I wonder if we should strike first before that other guy strikes me. This is a situation where you could have a nuclear exchange in the Middle East that, at least at the beginning, Israel wasn't even a part of. Although almost inevitably it would be drawn in. The only way to stop this terrible scenario from coming to pass is to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons in the first place. And given that all the other alternatives have failed, I think that the only way to stop them is through the preemptive use of military force. This is an extraordinary